Hello photographers, direct support for these videos comes from sales of my video courses or the use of my affiliate links, all of which can be found down in the description. In this video I'm going to show you the best settings for low light photos with your Canon R6. Now, here's the thing. There are no best settings for low light because shooting in low light is situational. There's tons of different situations. So what we're actually going to do here is go through a process of setting your settings to get the best photos you can get in low light. That way in any situation, you can get good low light photos no matter what. We're going to start by putting the camera in manual mode because we want control over our settings so that we can tell the camera what to do. This is important because if you leave the camera to its own devices, lots of times it will screw you. So in manual mode, we're looking at our ISO, aperture, and shutter speed settings because these control the amount of light we capture when we're taking photos. And these are the most important settings when you're shooting in low light. The first setting you want to figure out, what I would call the anchor setting, is your shutter speed. Because in low light, one of the biggest concerns is catching blur. And there's two blurs to worry about. Blur from camera shake and blur from subject movement if the subjects are actually moving. Now the shutter speed for moving subjects is a moving target because how fast the subject is moving determines the shutter speed you need. So that is also situational. For example, if you're shooting a football game at night, you might need a shutter speed of around 1/500th of a second. But if you were shooting your kid just playing at your house, you might need a shutter speed of 1/60th or 1/100th of a second. So that is something you have to determine based on the subject you're shooting. Motion from camera shake you can determine based on the lens you are using by using what's called the focal length rule. Now the focal length rule is actually more of a guideline, but what it says is that you can safely handhold your camera and get a sharp photo by setting your shutter speed to 1 over the focal length of your lens or faster. So what does that mean? Well, I'm using the Canon 24-105 lens on this particular camera. And for the purposes of this example, I'm going to zoom the lens all the way out to 105 millimeters. And if I was taking a picture with the lens zoomed to 105 millimeters, then I would want to set my shutter speed to at least 1/105th of a second. Now, if we go through our shutter speeds, mine's currently set to 1 second, but if we go through our shutter speeds, you'll see that we actually don't have a shutter speed of 1/105th. We have 1/100th, and then we have 1/125th and 1/80th of a second. So this is part of the reason it's a guideline, because often you're not going to be able to get the exact shutter speed to match the focal length of your lens. When you find yourself in that situation, choose a shutter speed that's close enough. In this case, I would choose 1/100th of a second because that's nearly perfect. Now, the other reason I chose 105 on this lens for this example is because if you are using a zoom lens, I just recommend you choose the shutter speed to match the longest focal length of that lens. That way, no matter what focal length you use at any given time during the time you are taking photos, you know you should have a safe shutter speed to handhold your camera and get sharp photographs. Now, once you've got your shutter speed set, the next thing you want to do is set your aperture. And setting your aperture is easy because when you're in low light, you want to let in as much light as possible for the pictures you are taking. And what that means is you want to set your aperture to the smallest aperture number, which will give you the largest opening in the lens to let in as much light as possible. Currently, my aperture is set to f22. You change the aperture by spinning this rear control dial here. And I'm going to spin that all the way down to the smallest aperture number, which is f4. Now your aperture will likely be different depending upon the lens you're using. So what's important is not the f4. What's important is the smallest possible aperture number for the lens that you're using. Now once you have your shutter speed and your aperture set, the last setting to set is your ISO. And to do that, you're going to use your exposure indicator as a guide. So I'm going to press my camera shutter button to wake up the exposure indicator, and I'm going to set my aperture, watching my exposure indicator, waiting for it to move up to the 0. And here at ISO 8000, it brings me to 0 on the exposure indicator. Now you'll notice that as the camera moves around a little bit, the exposure indicator is also jumping around. That's fine. As long as you're in the ballpark of 0, you should be fine to go ahead and take your photograph. And you can always adjust the ISO up or down if you're not satisfied with how the photograph looks. So this process of going through and setting your settings like this is something that you should try to do ahead of time before you actually need to be like taking the photos that you want to take. Once you've got these settings set, you can fine tune your ISO to adjust the exposure up and down as you need to make the photos look the way you want. Now, there is a way you can make this easier, and that's by engaging the auto ISO function on the camera. If you're not familiar with auto ISO, when you enable that, it allows the camera to set the ISO for you, and when the camera sets the ISO, it's going to set it to bring the exposure indicator to 0. So what that means is if you have auto ISO enabled, once you set your shutter speed and your aperture, the camera will just set the ISO for you and you won't have to worry about it. So I'm going to engage the auto ISO by spinning my ISO control dial all the way until it says auto. And with that done, you'll notice that the exposure indicator rests at 0 and the camera is just setting the ISO for me. It's not even showing us what it's set to, it's just taking care of it. So that can simplify things, especially if you're in a situation where you're moving around and the lighting might be changing a little bit from place to place, which would mean if you're doing it manually, you would need to be constantly watching your ISO and your exposure indicator and adjusting them. Now, there are a couple of things I want to mention here. Number one is that when you're shooting in low light, generally speaking, you're going to need to use higher ISOs. When I set it manually, you saw that I set my ISO to 8,000. And you might be thinking, well, oh, at ISO 8000, you're going to get noise. And noise is bad, which means you shouldn't do that. You should only use ISO 3200. And that's bullshit, okay? If you need a higher ISO to take a photo, then use the higher ISO. I would rather have a noisy photo than have no photo at all. What you do is entirely up to you. And if you believe that ISO 3200 is the max you should shoot, fine, don't take the picture. I don't care. To me, we love photos, and these cameras are amazing. The R6 is a full-frame camera with beautiful high ISO performance. There's no reason you shouldn't feel comfortable shooting at a higher ISO. And the very last thing I want to mention is image stabilization. Different Canon lenses have image stabilization available on them, and using your image stabilization can allow you to use slower shutter speeds while still getting sharp photos by avoiding blur from camera shake. It's hard to say how much slower you can go because image stabilization varies from lens to lens. It's something that you absolutely should test with your camera and with your lens. The other thing that causes variation is how steady you as a person hold the camera. If you are really shaky, image stabilization is going to be less effective for you than it is for someone who's going to have a solid grip and hold their camera very steady. So I would say, generally speaking, your image stabilization is probably good for one stop, but it is something you should absolutely test. And what that means is, if we go back to our example with my lens here, I went to 105 as the longest focal length on my lens for my shutter speed. And if I go one stop slower, with image stabilization, I should be safe shooting at 1/50th of a second instead of 1/100th of a second. I would absolutely test this, but it's something that you should know about. Now, I put all of this together in my low light cheat sheet, which you can get at this link right here. And if you have any questions about this low light stuff, let me know down in the comments. If you want to do that YouTube bullshit to help me out, that's great. Like, subscribe, whatever. But make sure you take some damn photos.